It was mainly, I would say, in the 90s. Now they've improved the techniques.
Yeah.
And they use a lot more transfusion. So you don't, because the problem with that is when your blood is too thick, the heart has to do a lot of work to make it pump. Again, it's the same as if you want to pump yogurt versus water. That's very much the analogy you can take. So literally, as you were saying, they had the alarm with the heart rate monitor, where if the heart rate drops too much, the alarm goes off. They jump on the bike, get the heart going, and then go back to bed.
Oh, God.
So now what they do instead is they do blood transfusion. So your blood is not thicker, but instead of having 5 liters, you will have 6 or 7 liters in the system. So they get around that, and it's your own blood, so it's harder to detect.
Yeah.
I can't think of any more human activity than conducting science experiments.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
The beauty of a living thing is not the atoms that go into it, but the way those atoms are put together.
What I always think should be the basis of education is not answers but questions. We should teach kids how to question.
Welcome to Blab Codes. My name is Hamid Siddiqui. Today on the podcast, I had Dr. Julien. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I should have probably gotten him to pronounce it. It's got an X in there and it's tripping me up. So, sorry, Julien. Nonetheless, Julien was a great guest. We spoke about a bunch of different things, from his research into altitude training. So, his research was actually one of the first in the world that looked at how altitude training could be utilized by athletes to improve their conditioning and their endurance and their performance. It's pretty fascinating. And then we talked about doping. We talked about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, surprisingly, which was really cool. A bunch of other stuff, even fatherhood. So that was pretty cool. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you guys will too. But don't forget to also like our Facebook page and rate and review us, please. That's really important if you could do that. It would help us a lot, and that would be great. Nonetheless, I should say, without further ado, my interview with Julien. So I saw you at the 3-minute thesis, and you won that competition.
Yes.
And I thought your research is very fascinating. But before we get into that, as you said, let's go into the journey. Something I'm very curious about is, how do scientists get into science? You know, what motivates them? What is the initial spark that creates the flame that many researchers have, and that gets them interested in pursuing what they're doing? So what is that spark for you?
I think it was just curiosity. Somebody who gets bored quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So having a job which is not as repetitive as some others may be was definitely the defining factor for me.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started, I predestined myself to be a school teacher. Literally, I wanted to be a PE teacher, physical education. But very quickly, I just thought, there's no way I'm going to survive doing the same job every year, 20 hours a week, because that's what we do in France for the next 40 years. And somebody just switched me on like that in the lab. We did some research, and there was PhD students doing casual hours the same way as you guys are doing. And I just got completely hooked up straight away, and then I gave up very quickly the pathway to become a teacher, and so I would try my luck with research.
So did this happen in like high school, or was this more at university?
No, that was already at university level. When I was in high school, I probably wanted to be a soccer player.
Oh, really? French, of course.
I used to be half decent back in the day.
Nice.
But went into sports science. And then it was a very different format to the BSc, Masters, and PhD that we have at the minute.
Mm-hmm.
But roughly during my BSc, that's when I got introduced to research.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, literally during a lab in one of my units, we started to do some testing and things, and I thought that was interesting. And I actually stayed for an extra year towards the teaching path because that was not closing any doors, so I could still keep my options open. But then after that year, it was the last straw, and I said, "No, screw that." And I went for research, and as they say, I haven't looked back since that, and the rest is history.
That's such a so going from wanting to become a like a PE teacher to becoming a scientist, that's such a those are two completely different worlds.
Completely, yeah.
What exactly, what did you just run an experiment and then it hit you? I'm like, oh wow, science is the shit, I have to do this? Like, how did it happen?
That was very much like that. Yeah, we had practicals in the lab, and again, the casual staff were here to help us, and we were devising some small research projects, really something basic, just to test physical fitness from people. And I thought, that's pretty cool. That's a nice thing to do. And yeah, that's it. I thought, I'd like to do more of that. We're all the same. We want to have fun a little bit, so
right.
Yes. It's probably less fun now than it used to be, more responsibility, but at least the research part is still very exciting, for sure.
So after that, so you had that realization, you still kept your doors open for teaching. When did you close that door and really set into research?
Literally, that would be the equivalent of the end of the BSc. So at the time, it was a 2-year plus a 1-year degree. So at the end of the 3rd year, which is, again, the BSc, that's when you had to decide whether, because in France it's a separate exam, so you have to sit a national exam that every single student in France sit on the same day, and etc. And then it's a numerus clausus. You have a number of spots every year. And I thought, not interested in preparing for that exam. And I went into the first year of an MSc, which was it was still a bit open, but it was training and management of sport. And then from there, it was again a 1-year degree. Then I changed university, went to Paris to do a proper master's focused just on research. And I actually contacted the lab I wanted to work with on a project I wanted to work with in that new university, new city and everything, and started to work on that for my MSc, and then carried on as a PhD student.
So what, just backtracking, so the MSc is the Masters of Science?
It was actually in sports science. We had that would be a Master of Science here, the equivalent, but that was a dedicated one in sports science, yeah.
Okay. And then when you moved to Paris, over there, you had an idea of what project you wanted to do?
Yes.
And what was that?
So the project was, I used to be quite interested in mountaineering, and I still am. And really that project was on high altitude training. So anything to do with that. And the person I got in touch with, Professor Richalet, was a big name back in the day in terms of high altitude research. And again, thinking, I like climbing mountains. Yeah, well, why not try to make a living out of it? I was probably a bit naive to think I would make a living out of climbing mountains, but I really wanted to join both. And that's how I got in touch with him. And he said, I have that big project, which is partly funded by the French government of sport and the International Olympic Committee, to assess high altitude training. So you're talking about early 2000, 2002 when I started the PhD, and that was at the time where they were, they were wondering what to do with high altitude. Should they consider that as doping and ban it, or should they allow it? And the other question was, is it safe for athletes to use? Because it's like when people are trying something out, they just go crazy.
Oh yeah.
And
especially
they try everything and anything.
Yep.
And you really, really try to push the boundaries.
Yep.
And putting themselves at risk. So that was one of the questions, was really, is it safe? And the other one, is it efficient? And if yes, should we consider banning it because it could be considered as doping practices?
So they were thinking that high altitude training, because it may have been so effective, they said we can't let our athletes do it.
Yep.
Even if it was possibly completely safe.
Yep.
How does that make sense? I don't get the logic behind that.
I think the problem is most people are actually using artificial altitude. So you basically build a room like this office, but it's sealed, and you have a pump which is changing the percentage of oxygen in the room to simulate altitude. And some people started to think that it is not kind of a natural process of training, and that's why it should be considered as doping. Then the argument is, first, how far do you go? Is training doping? If you start to resonate like that, if I have a better training protocol than yours, am I getting some illegal advantage? And the second thing is, how about all those who are born and bred at high altitude? They can't do anything.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about all the countries in Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, or all the South American countries, Bolivia, what do you do with these? Do you kick them out of the Olympics because they have an unfair advantage?
Right.
So that's the reason why it never made it to the list.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, people ask the question thinking, what shall we do with that?
Yeah.
I think it was mainly trying to regulate the use of it.
Jeez, okay. It's just fascinating because I follow mixed martial arts very closely, and doping is a big issue for them as well. And recently they had to, they brought in an independent body to make sure they drug test everyone. But to your point, I mean, what is considered doping? Like supplements? Like, what if you eat certain types of food that other people don't have access to? What about your genes? Are you some people naturally produce more testosterone, so are you naturally doping? That's tricky.
That's a difficult debate, and that's why actually they go more and more towards this biological passport, where instead of focusing on the one-off drug test, they tend to follow people up over the years so that they have an idea of the trend of different physiological parameters. And again, the one that I was close to was the amount of red blood cell and hemoglobin. And there's been some people who actually managed to demonstrate that they naturally produce more than others, and it's just the way they are. I mean, with the last, what was it, the athletics in London, they literally just finished the world championships last week. There's always that debate with that African athlete. I can't remember exactly which country. South Africa, I think. Semaya. She's a female athlete, obviously, but she's producing she has too much testosterone, so she looks very masculine, and she tends to kick everybody's butt because of that. And some people have been trying for years to actually exclude her, saying that she has an unfair advantage. Well, she's naturally the way she is. She just has too much testosterone, and that's it. And there is no real ground to do that, but yet some people are saying that's unfair.
Yeah. Doesn't she have like testes instead of ovaries that produce testosterone? That's something I heard.
I don't know exactly where it's coming from, but when you see her, she has a very masculine physique for sure.
Yeah, she's kicking everyone's ass.
Yeah.
But
the thing is, she's not the only one being like that, and then do you want to? I don't know, if you're very tall and you get an unfair advantage in high jumping, shall you be banned? Do you want to start to be the same as modeling, where you need to be taller than that height but shorter than this height and don't weigh more than that? Where do you stop?
Yeah. That's a slip. It's like a piece of string.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's hard to draw that line. So they wanted to investigate the effects of high altitude training. Tell me about your research project and what you did and what you found.
Yeah. So the actual project was literally what we did is we had 3 studies which were on 3 different populations. So one was with Nordic skiers, another one was with swimmers, and the third population was middle distance runners. Mm-hmm. And we submitted them to different protocols of a specific model of altitude training, which is called Living High Training Law, and study the effect and the innocuity, the safety of that model. So where that model is coming from is basically from the fact that traditionally it all started back in the day before the Olympics in Mexico in 1968, because Mexico is at high altitude. So people started to think about that and see how you could improve performance. And as a matter of fact, actually they realized that all the sprinting and jumping events got world record broken, while all the endurance events got absolutely dreadful results. And that really kickstarted a lot of the research in terms of high altitude performance. And what
so the implication was the higher altitude helps not with the endurance aspect, but the first example that you
the shorter distances. So it's
sprinting,
thinner air is helping with running faster and jumping longer, but the lack of oxygen, inverted commas, is actually detrimental to aerobic performance.
Oh wow, okay.
Because you take less oxygen on board, therefore you deliver less to the muscles and they can't work to the maximum capacity.
Right.
Which is why performance is affected. And then people start to think about ways to improve that.
Right.
And
just to add, so also if you have quote unquote low oxygen levels and your body is used to sprinting, then it gets good at using those low oxygen levels and actually upregulating biochemical pathways that would be involved in like anaerobic.
Yeah, the main
Would
thing
that-
is the anaerobic metabolism for sprinting doesn't require oxygen.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if you don't get much. The recovery is a bit harder because that's when you need the oxygen to replenish the stores of ATP. But really during the event, when you have 100 meters over 10 seconds, you don't need oxygen for that.
Yeah.
So that's why they were fine. And then fast forwarding a little bit, early 90s, a guy from Texas, Ben Levin, started to think that you could actually mix them both, because the problem with high altitude is you can't train the same way as you train at sea level. So then if you maintain the same amount of training, you run the risk of being overtrained. But if you decrease the charges of a training, by how much do you need to decrease them? So you may detrain. So what he came up with is you live at high altitude so that you benefit from that. You stimulate the system to produce more red blood cells, but you train at sea level to keep the same training, hence the living high, training low model. And that was the hype. It still is the hype with the athletes. It seems to be the most efficient way.
Yeah.
And we were the first ones really to demonstrate in high-end athletes, because we had Olympic type of standards and World Cup, World Championship standard athletes. So we were the first ones to demonstrate that even in top class athletes, it actually does work. Some others have discussed that more recently.
Yeah.
It seems like there are some conditions that you really need to meet for it to work, but
Right.
that was a bit of a breakthrough in the field back in the day.
That is fascinating, because I've heard this debate, and again, my love for the UFC, they talk about. Sorry, let me just. Yeah, so in the UFC, I've heard athletes just use exactly that program where they train really intensely at sea level, and then they go back at altitude where they even have those hyperbaric chambers, I think, where they sleep at a lower concentration of hydrogen, so it stimulates that red blood cell production. That is a pretty cool finding.
It is. I mean, it's very broadly used. We actually worked with a boxer, Nathan Cleverly, when I was working in the UK in Wales for his first bid for a world belt. We did some work with other Olympians as well who competed in the 2012 London Olympics. And what most of them are doing, as you were saying, they basically set up a tent in their house and they sleep in the tent. So you're at home and you have your husband or wife sleeping in the bedroom, and you're camping you're camping in the spare bed, really.
Yeah.
But what they've done is they've banned the use of these tents in the Olympic Village. So you're not allowed to bring your equipment on site anymore. Some people are getting around it by not sleeping in the village. But you're technically not allowed during the duration of the events.
Yeah.
We actually had that in London. They did that when I worked because after my PhD in France, I actually moved to Canada, and that was before the Vancouver Olympics, and they actually built some dedicated full apartments so that people could live normally and not be restricted to a small tent in the city for them to train for 2 or 3 years before the actual Olympics in Vancouver, the Winter Olympics.
Wow.
It is crazy. It's fascinating when you think about it, because it's a real market. There's just so much money in the sport at the minute that people are really ready to invest heavily to give their athletes the edge, because it's the name of the country and etc. So,
and I feel like athletes are like sports cars. Like many of the advancement in sports cars have led or come into what commercial cars like ABS, all these cool features that we get from sports cars, companies doing research and pushing their research in that way. And I feel like athletes are pretty much the same thing. So all the research that's been done to give them that 1-2% advantage, which is huge at the top level, right?
Yep.
Trickles down to us ordinary people, and we learn, we can do all this stuff to optimize our own training and our own health.
Definitely. I mean, that's what brought me towards the more clinical research. Exactly as you said, how it trickles down. And now you start to have people actually suggesting that you could use hypoxia as a way to treat obesity.
Really? So it's hypoxia, the lack of oxygen.
The lack of oxygen, high altitude. So literally, if you're obese, some are arguing that you may want to move probably out of Australia because we don't have high altitude here.
Yeah.
But somewhere, you actually don't need to be too high, but even cities like Denver, which is 1,600 meters of altitude, or even a bit higher, could be potentially beneficial because of the alterations to your metabolism when you live at high altitude.
Right.
It is very theoretical at the minute, but the reason why I'm saying that is because I've actually reviewed a grant from a colleague for people in New Zealand who proposed to do exactly that.
That study, wow. This brings this is one of my favorite comedians, Joe Rogan. He moved to Colorado, and he was saying that just walking like at that altitude felt like he was jogging it was so much more taxing on his body. So is that one of the reasons why you use more energy? Or is it that you use more energy, or you just get fatigued because your body is preventing you from using all the energy you have?
It really depends what type of activity you have. Again, the day-to-day life is mainly aerobic, so you require the oxygen. So if you drop the level of oxygen, it's definitely going to affect your day-to-day life. But I think it's probably more on the biochemical side where the whole metabolism will be affected. But I'm thinking of which some actually colleagues from Canberra, from the Australian Institute of Sport, probably 20 years ago now, published a paper that an altitude as low as 500 meters is enough to affect performance in high-end athletes.
Wow.
So, when we think about high altitude, we're thinking about high mountains, but you don't necessarily need to go very high to start to feel the effects. So your friend, this actor who was talking about, again, Colorado, I suppose Denver, which is usually where you land, is only 1,600 meters.
Yeah.
It's not very tall by any stretch of imagination, but yet it can be sufficient to make people who are quite responsive feel the effects.
Yeah. And apparently if you're pregnant, it's not good to be in high altitude. There's higher chances of miscarriage.
There's been some studies, These will be mainly on natives. So again, South America, Bolivia is a typical example, or Peru, where the miscarriages are more present, and I think the babies are born smaller usually. They tend to catch up a little bit later on, but
right.
High altitude natives are an absolutely fascinating population.
Why?
Because you have very different responses. So when you think about it, we obviously don't do well at high altitude because we're not used to it. We'll go on holidays and come back down and that's it. While the people who are born and bred, you would think that they're used to it and they've been there for generations. But actually what the research is showing is that you have a difference between South America and the Himalayas.
The what, sorry?
The Himalayas. So
the Himalayas,
where Everest is. And the reason is the Andes are younger mountains than the Himalayas. So people have been exposed to high altitude for longer in Tibet than they have been in South America. So we do poorly. The Tibetans do very well, and people in the Andes are somewhere in between. And some of them are doing extremely well. Some others are doing extremely poorly. So it's an absolutely fascinating model from an evolutionary point of view because of that. And those who are not doing too well, they develop what's called chronic mountain sickness, which is actually a condition in which they overexpress EPO, so they produce too many red blood cells and they just can't switch it off, which means that they end up with very thick blood. And it's very much like yogurt. You're talking about a blood which is twice as thick as what we have. And obviously they're throwing thrombosis and etc. And they really don't do well.
Wow, and that's dangerous because you could get like stroke.
Yep.
Yeah, I've heard of stories where in the Tour de France, like bikers literally in the middle of the night have to go on rides because they've taken such amounts of EPO that their blood is so thick that if they don't do that, supposedly they might have a stroke.
Yes, it was mainly, I would say, in the 90s. Now they've improved the techniques.
Yeah.
And they use a lot more transfusion. So you don't, because the problem with that is when your blood is too thick, the heart has to do a lot of work to make it pump. Again, it's the same as if you want to pump yogurt versus water. That's very much the analogy you can take. So literally, as you were saying, they had the alarm with the heart rate monitor, where if the heart rate drops too much, the alarm goes off. They jump on the bike, get the heart going, and then go back to bed.
Oh, God.
So now what they do instead is they do blood transfusion. So your blood is not thicker, but instead of having 5 liters, you will have 6 or 7 liters in the system. So they get around that, and it's your own blood, so it's harder to detect.
Yeah, but they can detect. I heard they detect the plastics in the IVs that they ban that in the UFC.
Yeah.
I was gonna say something. I was gonna say, yeah, your point about how athletes push things to the extreme. That's one of them.
That's one of them, definitely.
That's so crazy.
How much is too much? Yeah, that's...
Wow.
Here is a clue. That is too much.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Some people are crazy because they just want to be great. You know, what's funny is that I listened to Lance Armstrong. He was on the Joe Rogan Experience. It's a 3-hour podcast, and they were talking. And he's like, everyone's doing it. Everyone's like, he goes, you don't understand the mindset of an athlete. Like, they're willing to do anything and everything.
For a minute of glory.
Yeah,
Yep.
to make it to the top.
Yep. It is a difficult one. And when you think about it, again, you know, I might be a pessimist, but when everything blew up, I think that was in the Tour de France 1997 with the Festina affair, where they said half of the peloton is on EPO. They were racing at a certain speed. We are 20 years down the track. They're racing faster. And we're supposed to believe that everybody is drinking clear water now.
Yeah,
so, you know, are they getting better at it? Don't get me wrong, training has improved. There is probably more selection and etc.
Yeah.
But I think thinking that most of them are clear is probably a bit
It's
naive.
Yeah, for sure. And when Lance Armstrong, when they stripped him of his titles, apparently the next natural person out of all the people that competed was like number 19 or number 20.
They pretty much all went down at some stage in their career, yeah.
Yeah.
Either they admitted afterwards when it was too late to, you know, when it was prescription for them to lose the titles, or they got caught at some stage. But yeah, the top ranked are, we can ask questions about them.
Yeah.
I'd say some of them, I'm still keen to believe that because it's a one event a year, you know, you plan everything around these 3 weeks for the Tour de France, for example. So I can believe that some of them could not take much, if anything, but those who are repeating the effort many times, you get to wonder. Really.
Yeah.
Again, I might be completely wrong, but
Yeah. Well, you know, in the UFC, what they're doing, and this is something I think you mentioned earlier, to look at trends, they collect your urine for like years, and then they might not be able to detect compounds that you might be taking now because they just haven't built the kits, the assays for it. But let's say 10 years down the track, they might have a kit or an assay for that specific compound. Then they can come back and test your urine from now, which is like 10 years have passed. And then if they find that you've tested positive, they strip you of it.
Yeah, definitely. They've done that as well in the Olympics. Some of the Russian athletes have lost their titles from 2012, and that was in the last year or so. So again, in retrospect, exactly the same way as you said, the technology has improved for detecting different compounds, and they went back and said, "Oh,
You did it.
you did it.
We caught you.
Got you."
Yeah. So in France, you said you did a master's of science, and did you also do your PhD
I
there?
did my PhD there as well, yeah. So maybe a tip for future PhD students. What I did is I made sure I was working on the same project during my master's and my PhD, which saves a bit of time. And actually, I have a friend who ended up doing his PhD in 2 years because of that.
Really?
Because he really did exactly the same thing between his master's and his PhD. So he had one study under his belt at the end of his master's, and then he did another one and a third one, and did everything very quickly. So he started a year after me on different aspects of the same project, but we finished literally a month apart. He finished a month after me.
Oh, wow.
So top tip, that can be a way to streamline your studies if you can. That is, as long as you go on with your supervisor, your project, and everything goes smoothly. But I think being strategic during your masters and trying to identify the right supervisor and potentially the right project can save an awful lot of time.
That's interesting. So I have a project that I've worked on in my masters, and I've considered whether I should change. And you know, the part of the benefit of changing projects is that you go to a new environment, you have new challenges, and you're forced to learn. But the downside, as you said, is that you have to start from scratch, and it takes ages. And something you spent 2 years already on, you understand it pretty well, and you can take it to the next level. Whereas if you start from scratch, like, it's going to be really difficult.
I guess there's no right or wrong answer. It's depending on what you're interested in and how you want to do things. But I thought for me that worked quite well to be able to save a bit of time, especially back in the day. I think things have changed now, and you can't really do a PhD if you don't have any scholarship. But I didn't have any support, so for me I had to work.
Oh, wow.
And of course, saving a year was quite significant.
Yeah.
I had teaching hours the same way as you guys, and that was it. And then I was teaching in my parents. So if I could save my parents a year, they're quite happy about that, really.
Yeah.
So that's what I made a point of trying to be as efficient as I could.
Yeah. So in your masters, what I should ask, what questions did you try to answer in your PhD that were different to your masters?
They were actually very similar, just a much bigger scale. So in the masters, I focused really on the performance, while in the PhD, I expanded it onto the actual mechanism. So it was really, is the performance improved following that living high, training low method? Yes or no? That was the masters. The PhD, I went into the mechanisms related essentially to oxygen carrying capacity. So all the red blood cells, EPO, and etc. And I added as kind of an add-on this security, safety aspect of it.
So can you just elaborate a little bit on the mechanism? We'll get into the security aspect.
The mechanism, the idea is, again, you go to high altitude to stimulate the production of red blood cells. So chronologically, when you go to high altitude, again, inverted commas, the lack of oxygen is making you breathe harder, which is a short-term response. A much more efficient and long-term sustainable response is to produce new red blood cells. So it starts with the release of EPO, and if the stimulus is sustained for long enough, then you will end up with new red blood cells. If you have more red blood cells, obviously you can carry more oxygen. So when you go back down to sea level, where you have the normal level of oxygen, all these extra red blood cells that you've produced will be here to help you carry more oxygen, deliver more to the tissues, to the muscles, for that instance, and your performance is supposed to increase. And that's really the chain of events that is behind it. Then the question is, how much altitude do you need? How high do you need to go? How many hours a day? How many days a week? Or how many weeks? So that was the kind of questions that we tried to answer, try to work out a dose of hypoxia, as it's called, a dose of high altitude that you need for that method to work. And really the point of these 3 studies were to try different protocols. So the first one we didn't do too well in terms of performance. We actually targeted too high an altitude, which means that the athletes couldn't recover from their training sessions and they actually got fatigued. So the anecdotal results showed us that probably a month or two, all their physiological parameters were back down to normal, but they felt very good. They had very good sensations because they had finally recovered. But when we tested them at the end of the training protocol, we didn't see any improvement. Then the second one, we thought, okay, we'll go for a lesser altitude. So we went up to 3,500 meters for the first study. We didn't exceed 3,000 for the second one, but we actually were limited with time, so we had a shorter duration, which means that the overall dose of hypoxia they received was less. Again, didn't show great results. And the third one, we finally nailed it. So we limited the high altitude to 3,000 meters and had them for 3 weeks. And they spent about 15 to 16 hours a day in their room. And we had tip-top results. And really, they were, as you were saying, the 1-2% that they are looking for to get the gold medal. As a group, they definitely had that, achieved that. And we were also interested in how long the effects would go on for. So we studied them again 2 weeks after the end.
Right.
And interestingly, once you get the protocol right, what we observed is some parameters start to go back down, like the red blood cells are back down, but your performance is actually still improved.
Really?
And we thought that it would be because you have almost kind of a potentiation of the training. So when you go back, because you have this extra boost, your training sessions are that much more efficient and you benefit from that a bit further down the track, even if all the physiological markers are back to normal. At least that was the idea that we suggested for that.
So how would the efficiency improve?
So what I mean by the efficiency is again just the training sessions. You are able to push yourself a little bit harder.
Okay, so they are able to train harder and keep themselves at a higher level.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I thought maybe, because I thought technically they're probably doing the same thing. As in, if they're
Yeah.
trying to do a certain drill over and over again, but it's because they can do it better.
And you recover a bit better because again you require the oxygen when you recover. So if you have more red blood cells, you deliver more oxygen to the tissues, and you're supposed to recover better. Again, it's never been really tested,
Yeah.
but that was the theory
That's-
behind it.
That's the idea behind it. That's fascinating. So you said you went to Canada.
So after my PhD, that was a great thing to be involved in that project. But because it was a funded study by the IOC mainly and the government, there was a deadline and no hope of getting more money to keep going in the same field. So all of a sudden I found myself with nothing to do, really. And what I did is actually did some work for industry for 6 months. I got a contract with Polar, which is a company designing watch. So the same way as the smartwatches that we have now, they're actually still on the market with heart rate monitors and things. And they just designed a new one that they wanted to have a scientific validation for. So I got the contract to do that as a consultant. And in parallel, I applied for postdoc funding. And again, through colleagues who were, should say friends probably, less formal, friends who were working with me during the PhD, they got in touch with a guy in Canada during a conference. Another top tip, speak to people in conferences.
Yeah.
And the guy was basically saying, we have a crap load of money in Canada because the petrol was through the roof. So in Alberta, where I went, they had loads of money. And I'm looking for students. So whoever you know who is interested, just make sure that they get in touch with me. So I contacted the guy. We applied for a grant. And I got it, and 6 months later, I moved to Canada. And as a matter of fact, another 2 students who were working on other projects as part of the big study ended up at some stage in exactly the same lab as me. One spent 2 years with me, and another one visited a couple of times here and there. So they really were, having a fair bit of money for people to come and visit and etc.
Right.
So yeah, October 2006, I moved to Canada.
To Canada. And did you know what you were going to work on, or did you just look at dollar signs and said, this is where I need to be because I'm going to get some funding for whatever I want to do?
I kind of knew, yes and no, because I got the money based on the project. So it was usually when you apply for a grant, it's the project itself, your CV, and the interaction between all the different parties. So the supervisor, you, the lab, the project to see, and etc. So we knew what I wanted to work on, and it was kind of an extension of what I did. So as I was doing my PhD focused on EPO, red blood cell, oxygen transport, other guys actually discovered that EPO can stimulate ventilation.
Ventilation?
Yep.
What do
So
you
it
mean?
makes you breathe a bit harder.
Okay.
At least they did that in mice. And they actually used a model of transgenic mice that are overexpressing EPO. So they did some very basic science work, benchtop, where there are 2 lines of mice. One is overexpressing EPO everywhere in their body. The other line is only overexpressing EPO in the brain. And the idea is you can tease out the central chemoreceptors that are responsible for the control of breathing from the peripheral chemoreceptors that are also responsible for that. And what they observed in the animals, at least, is that EPO can stimulate ventilation and again improve your acclimatization to a higher altitude. So I wanted to expand that and see if we had the same effect in humans. And that was the bulk of the project. But interestingly, the lab I went to had very little interest in the control of breathing. It was really a vascular lab with a big interest on the brain. And I barely knew where the brain was at the time. I really knew nothing about the field. So it was a massive learning curve when I arrived there to try to bend a little bit what I'm doing and getting up to scratch with the rest of the lab. But again, that was 2006. We're 2017, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years now. So
Wow.
So I guess I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So you went to test the effect of EPO on ventilation in humans.
Yep.
In that study, the mice study or the rat study, so they had transgenic mice, knockout mice.
Yep.
You had one that was over-expressing, I should say, of EPO in the periphery, so everywhere but the brain?
No, everywhere.
Everywhere?
Yep.
And the other condition was?
Only in the brain.
And what was it? What would that elucidate?
So the way we control breathing is via chemoreceptors. So these chemoreceptors are just sensing chemicals, and for instance, they're sensing oxygen, CO2, and pH. The peripheral ones that are, I shouldn't show my heart, it's actually in the carotid bodies. They focus essentially on oxygen, but respond also to CO2 and pH. The ones in the brain only respond to CO2 and pH, directly pH more so than CO2, but both are linked. And really that allowed them to see how we respond. By studying that, they saw the effect directly on EPO and the number of receptors, EPO receptors that you will have, and how that can stimulate ventilation.
Ah, that's fascinating. Okay, yeah, this brings back memories from Introduction to Physiology about your body being able to sense carbon dioxide as a means of determining your breathing rate. And I think that's one of the reasons why when people have panic attacks, right, they use a bag so they can re-inhale something that's got carbon dioxide.
Now you're getting me interested. So that's exactly what I'm doing at the minute. So what happens is when you breathe out CO2, so when you have less CO2 in the body, your body responds by vasoconstricting. So you reduce the diameter of your arteries. And if you reduce the diameter of some arteries going up to your brain, you have less oxygen going to the brain, which is why when you hyperventilate, you tend to faint. So the idea of putting a bag on is you rebreathe CO2, so that even if you're breathing hard, you're still bringing CO2 into the system. You don't vasoconstrict, you don't faint.
Oh, that is the coolest shit I've learned. I had no idea it was all about vasoconstriction and vasodilation.
It's the amount of oxygen going to your brain.
Oh, Julian, you blew my mind. That's crazy.
The brain's a funny organ because we obviously rely on oxygen, but it doesn't cope well at all without oxygen. And actually, and to make things worse, you don't have any stores. So if you take a piece of muscle, of skeletal muscle, we can store oxygen through the myoglobin, which is the equivalent of hemoglobin in the muscles. So you have some store and they can survive. The brain doesn't do well at all. So literally if you were to occlude the carotid arteries on both sides and shut down, within 4 to 6 seconds, you're off.
Yeah.
So that's as little reserve as you have. So that means that if you don't supply constantly, sufficiently, you're screwed.
Wow.
And same idea, when you stand up, we've all had that, you stand up, you have that black curtain and you feel a bit dizzy. That's exactly the same thing. When you stand up, there is a blood pool towards your feet, and then you have to fight against gravity. And very transiently, you don't receive enough oxygen. And the response is, let's close everything down, let's faint for a second, and then things are going to get better.
That seems so clunky. Why would it be designed like that?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Man, okay, that connects a lot of dots in my head when it comes to this stuff over here. And your in terms of cutting out your blood supply for like 3 or 4 seconds, even some people even less, because I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and so a lot of the chokes are blood chokes. They're not air chokes. So you could breathe normally, but within like 2-3 seconds, you just go like it.
Go black.
Disappears. And it's funny because I've been choked to sleep many times.
A few times.
In BJJ, nowhere else. But it's interesting because it's like an elevator closing down. Like it's literally shutting, and then you forget. And then when you come back, like your sense of consciousness disappears. Who you are, where you are, what you're doing, everything disappears. That's a mind trip.
Yeah. You actually did some work with BJJ.
Oh, did you really? Oh, no.
Did you frame that? You set it up.
No, I had no idea. Please.
So the idea is, it started with boxing, because I'm sure you're aware of all the excitement about concussion at the minute.
Oh, yeah, CTE.
And the idea is all the blows you receive in the head are obviously affecting the vasculature and setting you up for dementia in later life. And we demonstrated exactly that. We have a very neat paper about that. It's actually knocking off about 10 to 15 years of your life in terms of vascular aging. Wow. So if you take somebody who has never been concussed, who is, let's say, 40 years old, and somebody who is 40 years old but who has been boxing for years, that person, in terms of the state of the arteries, would be somebody older.
55 or something.
And similarly, physical activity can actually improve things by a good 15, 20 years as well. And we thought, how about BJJ?
Yeah. Before you get to that, so boxing involves physical activities. Can that mitigate some of the?
It does, but still, you're still at loss. So imagine when you stop boxing and you become very unfit. That's a double whammy, which is why many boxers are ending up with early onset dementia.
Oh yeah, and then no, that's true. And they get punch drunk and they can't talk. They forget everything. Yeah. Okay, well at least there's hope for us people who don't box.
Don't get punched on a daily basis.
Don't get punched in the head and exercise for God's sake.
And actually, we try to work out kind of an index because boxing is one thing, but you don't fight that often. But you train an awful lot.
I was going to say that,
so that's we actually work kind of a sparring index, and we try to ask the boxers we studied again whether how much training and how much sparring they were doing, and that seems to be the biggest problem because that's what comes in every day, even if it's probably not to the same extent as a full-blown fight. It's a repetition which is really detrimental.
Yeah, I've heard that many times with UFC fighters. And this is obviously apparent in boxers as well. Most of the damage that gets done is not in the fight itself. It's the preparation leading up to the fight. And sometimes people get knocked out and concussed, and they might take 1 or 2 days off, and they have to come back to training and get hit in the head again and again. So tell me, your BJJ.
So, the idea was then, what with BJJ? Because actually you could see that as a kind of a conditioning. Because it's another slant of research, but there is some excitement about the ischemia preconditioning. So the argument is...
Can you just tell us what ischemia is?
So ischemia is basically when you occlude a blood vessel and you limit blood flow towards that tissue. So let's say if I were to put a cuff around my forearm and I inflate it quite high with a high pressure, I will stop blood flow towards the extremity, and that's ischemia.
Okay.
And the problem is, ischemia is one thing, but the reperfusion, the stress when you release the cuff and the blood rushes back towards the extremity, is just as detrimental as the phase during which you don't have oxygen.
Really?
And that's why when you think about, we were talking about stroke before, that's exactly what happens during a stroke, or that's what happens during some surgical interventions. So when you have, for example, a carotid endarterectomy, as it's called, so when they cut your neck open to clean all the junk in the carotid when you had a small stroke or just a transient ischemic attack, as it's called, TIA, that's exactly what they do. Usually they put a shunt around, but technically, that's exactly what happens. And that's detrimental.
Why is it detrimental?
Because of the stress that the reperfusion induces against the walls of the arteries. So it will trigger, so when the blood reflows, you will have a big surge of blood pushing against the walls, and that is stressing the walls and inducing the release of oxidative stress, which is damaging the blood vessels. And then again, we are talking about vasoconstriction, vasodilation. They become, instead of being very flexible, they become
more
quite
rigid.
hard.
Okay.
And so the idea is, before some surgery, people are actually suggesting that you want to do some cycles of ischemia reperfusion as a training. Some cycles, so you train.
Some cycles.
You go through the cuff up, cuff down, cuff up, cuff down, in order to get trained and prepare your vascular bed to be ready for the insult. And that's where the idea of the BJJ came from, because as you said, you basically you're being choked for a living, pretty much. That's part of the daily routine.
Oh yeah.
And we thought, these guys had an advantage because they're quite fit. And then they do that, which could give them an advantage. And we will have to come back in a year or two because we haven't analyzed the data yet. But that's the last study I did before leaving the UK about 2 years ago. It's on my board, BJJ FMD.
Oh, yes, it is too.
It's on my list of things to do.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating. One question, and this is a conversation that I've had with other BJJ guys, and you kind of, I'm curious if this is the case. So that release of the pressure where the blood goes back into that limb or wherever it's going, that in itself is detrimental because of the stress that it causes on the blood vessels. What about BJJ guys that get choked? Aren't the blood vessels in the brain being stressed over and over again? Possibly.
Again, we don't really know because I don't think there's been any work done with BJJ. But possibly. I mean, technically the idea is you should tap before you go off with BJJ. And you actually get better at it, at feeling when you're going to disappear once you've been choked a good few times. So there is an argument that, again, the beginners are probably at the greater risk than the more advanced people, but you have to go through the beginner stage before you are able to tap soon enough and you don't pass out.
Yeah. But also I find that beginners, and this is anecdotal, but this is something I find, people who don't train BJJ pass out quicker than people who train BJJ.
Yeah, you're learning how to cope with less oxygen. So again, it's a training, it's a stimulus. And I think that's part of the techniques, to be able to withhold the choke for longer before having to tap, so that it gives you a greater chance of escaping it.
Oh yeah, you try to buy as much as time as you can. And sometimes as you're going...
as you think about what should I do next.
That's happened to me a few times actually.
How about fainting?
Yeah, you can't stop.
No.
But it's a weird sensation. Wow, that's so cool, man. Wow, you're doing BJJ as well.
Yeah, we used to do that. Yeah, it's all coming from the clinical research.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the other research that you do, because I want to talk about specifically what you were giving the speech about during the 3MT or 5MT for academics. 5MT, yeah.
So that's a new hobby of mine, I would say. We did a little bit of obesity work when I was in the UK, but not much really. And here it's really by luck, meeting people, that I went into diabetes population, simply because we were sharing equipment with people from podiatry, and we started to talk about research ideas and etc. And then I went to visit a colleague in Canada last year, and they had a journal club, and one of the guys presented a paper about this heat therapy that I talked about. And I said, how about doing that, combining that with diabetes? So when I came back, I had a chat with the guys and said, why don't we do that? And the idea is, so the heat therapy is a very posh word for basically saying you're taking a foot bath. That's really, in a sense, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So you put your feet in a hot bath. You can immerse as much as you want. Some studies are doing up to mid-size. Some are doing literally just below the knee. Doesn't really matter. But the idea is the heat stimulus is actually opening up your blood vessels. So they're vasodilating, which is improving all the reactivity of the blood vessels. So they're responding more to challenges. So when we're talking about the CO2, the less of decrease in CO2, which makes your vasoconstrict, they would respond to these stimuli a lot faster, which makes your vasculature much more able to adapt to stimuli. Again, when we're saying you stand up, you have that black curtain. If your blood vessels are quite reactive, in theory, you should not have that as much. And in the case, so that's the idea behind that technique. And the way I want to apply it with diabetes is simply that patients with diabetes tend to have ulcers that are recurring. And one of the problems is their arteries are actually rock solid, and they can't bring oxygen to the site of the wound to contribute to healing. And that's why they stay open for a very long time, and they tend to come back. And the idea is,
and those ulcers tend to be in the periphery of the body more than, and that's because blood is harder to get to those areas.
Yes, they have what's called peripheral arterial disease. So instead of having really heart issues, it's going to be more towards the periphery, the extremities. And yes, that's typical of diabetes. So the vasculature of the lower limb is quite poor usually, and the ulcers are most of the time on the feet, usually towards the sole of the foot, sorry. And the idea is to see if we could use this heat exposure to open up the blood vessels and facilitate the oxygen delivery towards the site of the wound and contribute to healing.
That's fascinating.
And speed up the process. And again, hopefully, so the first step, because it's a look and see, it's never been done before, the first step is to see the effect of an acute exposure. So it's just a one-off 45 minutes in a hot bath. Is it improving the vasculature in this particular population which is diseased? First step. Then the second study that we have planned is the wound healing itself improving that? Or is it just, when you have, because the best practice is you go to see you visit the clinic on a weekly basis, and they just do treatment to the wound, trying to contribute to it closing down. But is it just taking care of the wound, or does it have beneficial effects on the whole vasculature? And the wound is just kind of an external marker, an external sign of the vasculature improving. We don't really know.
So just to clarify, so you're looking at how heat is involved in that in the rigidity of the blood vessels, and one way you'd know that it's helping is by helping heal the wound. But you're asking the question, is it just limited to that wound, or is the heat going to benefit the vascular system in more general terms?
So there are different levels and different approaches, and hopefully I'll be able to tackle them all in the future. So that's number one. Second one, because we have access to the clinic where the patients are followed up until the wound heals. So I want to repeat the same test afterwards to see if, again, wound healing is helping the overall vasculature. But then, as you were saying, the idea is heat exposure contributing to the wound healing. So the third study, that's probably a PhD studentship in there, would be to actually have repeated exposures. Let's say every day for 45 minutes you bathe your foot in hot water, and does that speed up the process, or does that improve the recurrence, i.e. decrease the recurrence, or things like that? So that's a third project further down the line.
So you're also, similar to how you did your PhD, are you also trying to develop a protocol that would be optimum for patients?
That would be the idea. At the minute, the literature uses 45 minutes at about 42 degrees. So I'm not sure exactly what's the reasoning behind it. I've never seen in papers a clear explanation of that's the most efficient or what. I suppose it's a compromise between, it has been proven to be efficient and it's not too taxing in terms of the time for the participants. So that's probably a happy medium. But then, do you need to do that every day if you're a diabetic patient? Or can you do just when you have an ulcer? Or we don't know. It's still open.
What would be let's just say you, in the future, you develop a really nice protocol. What would be the advantage of that compared to what is typically available for patients who have ulcers?
I think the big advantage is it's very cheap. You're literally talking about $200 for, and you could actually, that's if you buy a posh one which has a thermostat and etc. But you could have a bucket with tap water.
Yeah,
that can be very cheap. So that means that you can scale it up, and that can positively affect thousands and millions of patients worldwide. So that's a big plus. So you could potentially modify practice, and that could become part of the usual care of the patients.
And you're not introducing any drugs?
No, it's all clear. Nothing wrong with the International Olympic Committee or anything like that.
Nothing like exactly right.
It is good, because one of the other options that we have, and another work we've been doing recently, is the use of hyperoxia. So we've discussed a lot of work on hypoxia, but the exact opposite is hyperoxia. So you force more oxygen into the system. So similar idea, they go into closed boxes really, in which you increase the pressure and you're forcing oxygen to the system. And the reasoning behind it is exactly the same. You force so much oxygen that the body has to take more on board and deliver more to the tissues, and that's meant to contribute to healing. The problem is it's very expensive, so it will never be available to the majority of patients.
Can I suggest something that I've heard of, a similar way of producing hyperoxia? Have you heard of Wim Hof?
Nope.
Wim Hof breathing method. So he does it as a and I can forward you some study actually. He uses this. It's been shown in at least one study that I'm aware of. I have to really look at the validity of that. But from what I understand and from the reaction that I have seen from a lot of athletes who use his method, they see a lot of benefits. In fact, he's the one, I think he climbed Mount Everest with shorts on. They call him the Iceman. Have you heard of him before?
Yes.
Yeah. Supposedly he taught a group of 10 to 12 participants how to control their breathing. There's some underlying mechanism that I don't understand or hasn't been clearly explained, but they were able to control their immune response through their breathing. And the breathing technique is really deep breaths. It's almost like you're hyperoxygenating your blood. So you do that 30 times, and then you go through a cycle of doing that and then holding your breath for, I don't know, a minute or something, and then doing that over and over again. In fact, this is a technique that our coach uses just for meditation, and it's a weird sensation. I I can't really explain it to you because it feels like you're on drugs when you do it. It's really fascinating, but it's definitely hyperoxia because you're just overloading your system. So could you see something like that instead of some expensive equipment where patients can go through a protocol, let's say a 10-minute breathing thing that hyperexposed or that loads their blood with way more oxygen than normal, and that would be a cheaper way of doing it than to have a $10,000, $20,000 equipment do it for you.
Yeah, I wish it was 20,000.
Oh, 20 million.
Yeah, you're probably adding a couple of zeros, but
shit.
But I mean, it's a good idea. It's worth exploring. I'm not sure you will ever reach the same levels as hyperoxia because they're really able to boost so usually you have about 100 millimeters of mercury of pressure of oxygen in the blood.
Mm-hmm.
With hyperoxia, you're talking about 4 or 5 times that at least.
Oh wow!
So it is a significant stimulus, and I don't think you could be able to reach these levels with just breathing techniques. But that being said, again, as you were saying, if it's a lot cheaper, if anybody can do it at home, that might be more sustainable, and again, you can reach more people. So altogether, it can be more beneficial, even if individually the effect of the 2 hours, if you do 2 hours a week, or you do actually 2 hours a day for usually 30 sessions, as opposed to something you can do every day for the rest of your life, it could be more beneficial, even if the individual effect is less acutely.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something worth looking at. Yeah.
That's a research project.
Here we go. Another one for the board.
Wim Hof Breathing. You should check him out. He's
definitely,
a fascinating guy. He I think I don't know how many, like the distance, maybe it was like 50 meters or something. Under the ice, he made a hole, jumped underneath the ice, doing this breathing technique so he's got more oxygen so he can go on longer. And he has to come out from another hole that's like in a lake, and he swam too far because his eyes were frozen from the frozen water. Oh man, I got so, like, as you were saying this, or I'm like,
chills thinking about it. Yeah.
You're crazy doing that. Apparently he went, like, he's calculating in his head, okay, I'm this many feet away, and then he feels like, oh, that's too much. He's like, shit, what do I do? So he swims back like 20-30 feet back and then finds the hole. So
they usually dive with a line exactly for that reason, to make sure they can't find their way out.
This guy's crazy, and
he's
got a very interesting story. So Wim Hof, for the guys who are watching or listening as well, you should check it out. It's actually interesting. We're reaching an hour.
Oh, already?
Yeah, time flies.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Exactly. And I've had fun in this conversation. 3 questions that I always like asking my guests, and let's start with, what are some lessons that you've learned in your life that you can pass on to people coming up?
From, you mean the scientific point of view?
From any point of view that could help people coming up.
I think one of the big things for me was to do what I like. It's a bit cliche, but if you do what you love, you don't feel like working. And I have to confess that 10 years in academia, I feel like working more and more, and I have a bit less fun. But I really started on a very high and really enjoyed what I was doing for years, and that was great. And and just enjoy your years as a student. You probably think, oh, it's dreadful, I don't have money, I have these deadlines. Believe me, that is a good time. So you really make the most of it. And for me, it was superb. I enjoyed what I was doing. I was doing just what I wanted, when I wanted. I could get some money to go to conferences, to travel here, there. I mean, during my PhD, I went to the Himalayas, to Tibet. I went to South America. Wow. I went to Spain. Since I left France, I lived in Canada. I lived in the UK. I'm now in Oz. It's a great vehicle to do fun things. And really, I think a good take-home is try to enjoy it as much as you can. So there might be some decisions to make at some point. Do I really like that subject? Do I really like that guy I'm working with? Because that's important. And, do I need to sacrifice a few things and maybe move and explore the big world? But yeah, enjoying it, I think, is a big, big part of it, yeah.
So yeah, I've heard that before, and I think
that's very, very cliche. Yeah.
It's a cliche, but it's
a real one.
It's a real one.
I mean it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I agree with you that a student life is a good life because not many responsibilities right now. We can be selfish with our time. There's not a lot of consideration. I don't have a family I do have a family, but I don't have wife and kids that I have to feed.
Hopefully no mortgage.
Sorry?
No mortgage yet.
No. That's something I
Enjoy while it lasts.
yeah. No, that's something I realized early on. I said, yeah like that is something that will nail you down to a certain spot.
Yeah.
And I like to travel, and I get the sense that you like to travel because you have traveled many places. So I got to do all that before I nail myself to the cross.
Postdoc is a good way to do that.
Yeah. I hear 2-3 years every postdoc, get to travel a few different countries, learn a bunch of stuff.
It's a great experience. You usually have a bit more money. You still don't have much more responsibilities. You explore something else. I think it's a good experience to get, yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to not being poor and having very little responsibilities and yet the money, so some money.
Sounds like a dream.
Yeah.
Maybe you should be a postdoc for life.
Some people are running away from that insecurity. I'm running towards it.
Yeah, I know some people who actually have never strived to get a full-time position, and they're just going from contract to contract. You have some other downsides, but you have maximum flexibility. If you don't like it, you move on.
You're exactly right. So that's what I'm hoping to do. Until I settle down and have kids and family, then I have to look for something more stable and perhaps move away from postdocs and into podcasting. Maybe that make that work. Last 2 questions. Looking into the future, what are you afraid of? What scares you? And this can be in whatever context. It can be career-wise, anything.
Again, I think career-wise, it's really the disengagement of governments across the world into research. Because it is, again, cliche, but as far as I'm concerned, universities should be an investment. Yes, it is costing money to teach students, to train students, and etc. But yet you're training the next generation, which is going to generate the wealth of the country. And if you don't do that, your country is going to fall behind 20 years down the line. And that's my biggest concern at the minute, just in general. And again, it's not specific to Western Sydney or New South Wales or Australia. I've seen exactly the same thing happening in the UK and everywhere. The fees are going up. You have less and less money. You're sacking people and etc. And I personally think it's a mistake. I'm definitely biased, of course, but I genuinely think, all these politicians were where they are at the minute. They were in your shoes 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
And they got free education.
Yeah. So
completely free.
So it is, I'm coming from France. My most expensive year at the end of my PhD was something like $600.
What?
Of fees for the whole year. And that was by far, it's probably more expensive now, of course, because everything has increased. But, here you're talking about what you pay for a unit is probably more than what they would pay.
It's $1,000
for a year.
Yeah, a unit in undergrad. Yeah. It can be.
So, and then a lot more people have access to education. And the opportunities are just all of a sudden exploding for you.
Yeah.
So that's probably my biggest concern at the minute outside of a third world war.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think education and healthcare, these are things that as a society we should put extra care and attention towards, because it's not that people are going to take advantage of those systems. Sure, you'll have you'll always have that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't provide those services for people who need it. In fact, I think there's some research, and I've been hearing more and more about this, about just a base income as being the best way to address many issues in our society, to address poverty, inequality. Just give people money because they know what to do with it. Don't enforce what you think they should do with it.
They're talking about that in France at the minute. And actually, all the lecturers they're not exactly the same thing, but what you do when you get a lectureship position in France, you have your job for life. Oh. You simply can't be sacked. So you're working for the government, and as a government employee, you're there for life. Right. And genuinely, and so the many administrative people are like that, and all the teachers, so from primary school to higher education. And I would genuinely go as far as saying that even if you were to rape one of your pupils, I'm not even sure you would get sacked. You would
What?
probably be sidelined after your time in jail, obviously. But I'm not sure you would be. I'm probably making it up a little bit. But you see, you really have to push the system to really be sacked. And that was the idea originally, to give people the freedom of not worrying about their jobs and be able to commit and be fully immersed in it. As you were saying, you always have a percentage, a fraction, which is going to take the piece, but they would do in any system anyway.
Yeah.
But I think it's a pretty good system.
Yeah.
The downside is money is very poor. Because governments are broke, so money is not great. But in terms of research, you get a job. Once you have it, you're kind of safe.
Wow, that's really
It
cool.
is a big peace of mind.
That's really cool. The flip side of that question is, what is your aspiration? Before you leave this world, what do you want to accomplish with yourself? And I know that's a big question.
It's a big question. I mean, if you had asked me a year ago, I would probably have said be a successful scientist. Now that we're about to have a kid, I would say probably be a good dad. We'd be quite high on the list. Probably, as we were discussing before we started the podcast, a bit less selfish than I was a few months ago. I suspect just try to be do my bits and contribute, and if I can instill some fire into some students' belly, and so that they can take over and keep pushing the science, that's even better. But I think being a good father, a good husband is quite high on the list. Yeah.
Those are good things to aspire to.
Again, nothing original here.
Yeah. No, but it's good. You're totally right. I think as human beings, when you have a kid, that's the biggest project in your life, because if that kid turns out to be screwed, whose fault is it? It's yours. And by raising a shitty kid, you've kind of degraded society, because if everybody raised shitty kids, we're going to have a shitty society. You know what I mean? So this is probably the most important thing
Again,
you can do
to
as
some extent,
a
we're
human.
going back to education.
Yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
On a different level, but same kind of principle. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is like the most important type of education.
By far, yeah.
Yeah, raising good human beings. Cool. Thank you so much for your time, Julien.
Pleasure.
I've
Thanks.
enjoyed this immensely.
That was great, actually, yeah. I didn't know what to think of a podcast first time, but that was good.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it too. Cool. We'll see you guys next week.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Yeah, my lips are very dry. The wing yesterday.
You're gonna blame the dryness of your lips on the wind now?
Yeah. What else could it be?
I don't know, right? You tell me. It's your lips. God knows what you do with your lips. And by God, I mean an entity that you don't believe in, Alex.
I like how you asked him, is it recording audio?
Yes.
In Audacity.
Yes.
I like how you asked Julien, why would it be designed like that? And he's just thinking, it's not designed, you idiot.
I don't know what he's thinking.
Yeah,
bro.
I don't know what he's thinking either, but that's what I was thinking.
It is a shitty design.
Because it's not designed.
Bro, what are you laughing about? It is. It's designed through natural selection.
Yeah, well, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, but it is, man. I can't believe that our brains can't hold on to oxygen at all.
Yeah.
That's so strange.
Yeah. There was lots of really cool facts I learned in that one.
Muscle you can. So muscle has myoglobin, it's like hemoglobin, but in your muscle cells that store oxygen. But your brain, not so much.
No.
Huh.
Yeah.
As soon as oxygen.
And that's why he said it gives you what, like 4 seconds, 6 seconds, and then you're out once your brain.
I think it's less than that. If you choke a person who's got no Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training, or someone who's not used to getting choked, so for the freaks out there, you might have some resistance here. But usually, it's like 2-3 seconds, if that. But once you train your neck and you've been getting choked on a regular basis, hashtag freak time, then it's harder to actually choke you out. So I've been caught in situations where I'm about to see like the elevator doors just close on my consciousness, and I'm fighting like a rear naked choke. Should we show them what a rear naked choke is for the guys who are actually watching? So what you do...
Great.
Okay, let me show you what a rear naked choke is.
Uh-oh.
Alex is gonna cop it.
Do I have to stand up?
No, you
Good.
just have to sit down. So what you do is you put one arm underneath like this, you grab your own bicep, and this hand goes behind. And I'm just going to choke Alex for like half a second, and you tell me what it feels like. This shouldn't constrict your airways, but rather your blood, so...
Oh, yeah.
It's fun, huh?
Yeah, real fun.
If you hold on to that for like 2-3 seconds, and then it's like the elevator doors just close. But what's weird is that, like, I've been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for about 4.5 years now. I started February 2012, and now like you can actually see that. You can't literally see it, but you get a good sense of when you're about to pass out. And
So it's
how long
like it
will
happens in slow motion or something? Is that what you mean? Or
It just, you feel yourself leaving your body.
yeah.
And like it's like the elevator doors. It just gets darker and darker, and then you just...
I guess the more that you like perceive that the more you experience that little moment, the more you can expect what's going to happen. So it happens slower, or your perception of it is better.
That's definitely part of it, but I think just physiologically, and this is something I didn't even know, but supposedly when you do get choked, it helps. You know, he gave that example about the periphery in the arm. So if you cut the blood supply and let it go, you know, when you get your heart blood pressure monitored, actually the flow of the blood back into the vessels, there's so much pressure that it causes damage to the walls of the blood vessels. We think of our bodies as like these soft things. There's not a lot of pressure, not a lot of force, but in fact, I would actually recommend everyone out there to look at the blood flow. I think Mark Jones, our lecturer, showed us a video of how fast the blood actually travels.
Oh, yeah.
And so what he did, I think he showed us a video of the script. I forget where they were from, but essentially they had attached a camera, and they were like arteries and veins running across in the field of view, and they could literally slow down the flow of the blood because they would pinch the blood vessels, and you could see without, like, when it's running normally, like the red blood cells are traveling so fast that you can't even make out that there's any blood. But as soon as it slows down, and then you realize, oh, the blood is so incredibly crowded, and there's so much friction against, like, red blood cells against other red blood cells against the wall. There's so much force involved there that you wouldn't ordinarily think about. And when you take away, so if you stop the blood pumping into a limb and then you remove that pressure, all that forces, you know.
It's interesting how Julian was saying that it actually can be worse than the constriction itself.
And one of the ways you overcome it is by repeatedly preventing or putting pressure and releasing it, putting down pressure and releasing it. And this is something we do in Jiu-Jitsu. So that choke you just experienced, like, over the past 4.5 years, I've probably experienced it hundreds, if not 1,000 times. Getting choked and getting out, getting choked and passing out, getting choked, and, you know, you do that over and over until, like, getting choked and people playing with, like, doing this. None of this shit bothers me anymore. Because I've had that. I've had people's knees on my throat, on my face. I've had their shin on my throat. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't bother me whatsoever anymore. But it's amazing how your body can get conditioned.
That's what I was just about to say. It's all about that conditioning, isn't it? I thought. He's obviously a physiologist, and I thought maybe we could talk about physiology as a subject. Did you do physiology in your undergrad?
I did 1 unit, and that's why when you was talking about the chemosensors... Oh, I muted this. When you was talking about the chemosensors, I knew exactly what he was talking about. Did you?
Yeah, I did it as well, and I kind of picked it as an elective, and I didn't really want to do it. I'm like, oh, what is this? I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm just going to have to, like, do it because it's kind of all that's there and get it out of the way. Then I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating.
You learned some cool shit in that unit. We learned about all the different systems
and all of the labs, all the testing we did on ourselves, which is what I really liked about it as well. It's like you can perform these experiments, like, on yourself by measuring your blood pressure and then running and measuring it again and this type of stuff. And
didn't like students have to bring in, like, piss?
Yeah. I think there was one where we it was
smelled really pissy, bro.
like drinking water, drinking nothing, and drinking Coke, and
How can you
then
drink
measuring
nothing?
like a volume of urine that got expelled over the course of the lab class.
Right.
And like it's really interesting.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so I really like that part of it. He was talking a lot of. You guys had a big conversation about doping in sport, and I thought that's a really interesting kind of can of worms that we should get into.
Definitely, because this is something that I follow actually quite closely, because I'm a big fan of mixed martial arts and the UFC. And only a few years ago, the UFC, for the folks who don't know what that is, it's the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It's an organization where people essentially utilize all sorts of martial arts, whether it's wrestling, it's Jujitsu, Muay Thai, kickboxing, boxing, Taekwondo. All of those are put together, and they fight. But it's interesting, because what we would see is that these killers from like the 2000s, early 2000s, like Vitor Belfort was like he was like a monster. He was about at one stage he fought in heavyweight, he fought in light heavyweight, and then middleweight. So these are, you can think of them like from heavyweight to light heavyweight, there's about 20 kilo difference, and then from then on it's about 5 to 10 kilo difference. So it's a huge weight disparity, and he was accomplishing it by taking obviously steroids, and a lot of people used to take steroids in the UFC and many combat sports, until they had the USADA. So the guy who caught this is interesting. The guy who caught Lance Armstrong is the guy who the UFC hired to do
nice.
to do the drug testing.
He made a name for himself then.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why he went after him. In fact, there's people call him the golden snitch. For what he did,
Yeah.
It was after the fact. But so they've put in these really precise and accurate tests. In fact, they store your urine for like years after, your urine and blood years after the date of collection, so that they could test it against other assays, other tests that they may have developed, tests that may not be available right now to test for certain compounds, because there's this cat and mouse chasing game going on. The athletes are developing new ways of
hiding it,
it.
So they store all of the urine or whatever, all their samples, and then later when the technology's caught up, they can go back and catch it.
Because it could be like a close analog to a hormone or a compound that is performance enhancing now, but we just don't have the test for it. And in 5-10 years we might develop that test and say, oh, you're a cheat.
I think what's really interesting though is like, where do you draw the line on doping? Like, maybe we could have that conversation, because this is something that I think you guys touched on briefly, but didn't really go into it. Like what's considered doping and what isn't.
Dude, and what's going to happen in the future when we have gene doping, man? So right now, and just to go back to what I was saying earlier, so what happened with a lot of these athletes was a lot of them had this really amazing physiques, and then when USADA came in, all of a sudden, like a bunch of people started getting skinnier, what I mean? And their performance suffered. But your point, it's a great question. What happens, what is considered doping?
Like for me, I don't know, I reckon, because there's a whole lot of things that can enhance performance, right? And you kind of, like, someone who's in sport wants to enhance their performance in any way they can, like training, eating properly, all that type of stuff, having sports scientists help them out. All of these types of things enhance their performance. But then why do we have a problem with doping? And I reckon the reasons, it's got to be because you don't want that to become the norm in something like sport, because it discriminates against people who don't want to do that to their body, right? So maybe the line is what harms your body for doping.
But I don't think that's a good line because athletes will do any.
Yeah, they'll still do. I'm just
No,
saying,
no,
when we
mean-
draw
I don't
that
even-
line,
I don't even because athletes might do like, let's take away the drugs, yeah.
Yeah.
They will train harder than the other person.
Yeah.
And they'll get like fatigue.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Things like that, you know what I mean? They'll eat things
Yeah.
that other people aren't willing to eat. So if you draw the line between compounds that you can take, you know, exogenously, I think is the word.
Yeah.
That's an arbitrary line.
It is, and it also doesn't include their own blood and things like this,
Yeah,
which you would consider as doping as
doping.
well.
It's so tricky because supplements. I mean, what is considered doping? Is it you reach a line where people just it's not fair because other people can't access it.
Yeah,
But
but
you can
that's what I
apply
think. But
that.
no, but not only that. But I think if other people were to access it, would cause them actual physiological harm.
But what if
then,
you could do it?
Then you can't have that expectation that everybody who wants to be a 100-meter sprinter
Sure.
or something has to take X drug, or they won't be able to make it. And if they take X drug, they're going to die at 50. You know what I mean? That's not fair.
Okay.
So that's why X drug would be doping in that instance. Whereas somebody who says just trains a little bit harder, it's not necessarily, you know, everyone could just train a bit harder.
Yeah, but could you afford a nutritionist? Could you afford like rare supplements
Yeah,
that no
well,
one
that's
else has?
interesting. So is there economic, you know, if you're an athlete from a very rich country that puts a lot of money into sport, you're at an advantage over somebody who isn't. You know, so do we...
But what about genetic differences? You know, like the sports aren't fair, dude. That's the thing.
But that's why it's interesting. So but that's why it's an interesting discussion because, sports aren't fair. You're exactly right. Sports aren't fair. Not everybody is on an equal playing field in sport.
Yeah.
So, but then why do we have this rule against, which I support, by the way? I don't think whether people should be able to dope and things and take performance enhancing drugs. I think that should be wrong, right? But I find it's a hard one to justify, like, because you're right, sport isn't fair. So where do you try and draw that line?
Maybe,
you know, where do you draw that line to make the decision?
Yeah, maybe an argument could be made that kids coming up, that's where the danger is. You know, if kids have to
because you don't want to encourage harm. You know what I mean? Like you don't want to encourage taking steroids because they have all these side effects that are negative. Sure, they make you great at sport, this particular sport, but they have all these other negative side effects, and we don't want our best athletes to have this drug with all these side effects.
Yeah, but
say call it doping.
Yeah, but you want your athletes to go rigorous training, blow out their knees, blow out their backs. That's okay. But as soon as it comes to drugs that you put in your body, and in fact, I don't think that steroid use, like if you use it moderately and carefully, it's not as bad as people make it out to be.
Possibly, yeah.
You know, because it's one of those things that I think that's stigmatized. Outside of sports, I think like steroids and things like that, I mean, people use it for all sorts of like beneficial testosterone replacement therapy. Like when I hit 40, like my testosterone levels obviously is going to be lower than it is now. Guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna be on TRT, dude. I want to feel like I'm 30 something till I'm 70. I'm gonna be on like not crazy doses because that's what's unhealthy.
But then you're saying that we shouldn't necessarily have rules against doping? Would that be your position then? Sounds like that's where you're headed. Sounds like you're saying that people should be able to take any performance enhancer they want and compete. They should.
To be honest, they should. My only concern is about kids. But if
the only problem is like where does that?
Away the
what's
kids,
the end goal with that? Like look forward. Like let's say we make that rule tomorrow. Where do sports end up? And this would be basically every sport. It'll end up with people
being
to
more
be
honest.
an athlete. No, to be probably. But to be an athlete then at that level, you'll be sending a message that people have to take all of these drugs which have side effects.
But people already know. You know, the Tour de France, I mentioned this to him. Experts have made the argument.
But it could be worse in some sports than others.
Experts have made this argument that it's actually safer to be on performance-enhancing drugs and do the Tour de France than to be off it because your body can recover better. You can handle the stress more when you're on steroids, on performance-enhancing drugs, than when you're not. So it's actually safer to do that sport like that.
Yeah.
The only argument that would be is just for the kids, I suppose. That's the only thing that concerns me. Outside of that, I mean, the future itself is going towards that direction.
If something benefits you, like actually benefits you. I don't have a problem with sports people doing it. You know, like they have an ice bath after they come off the field because it helps their recovery, whatever. I don't care if it's chemical either, to be honest. You know, if something benefits them, their health, yeah. I don't have a problem with people doing that. I wouldn't call that doping, but that's where I draw that line. That's why I think that's a kind of a
what's
good
the whole
line.
point of doping? The doping is to improve.
But there's lots of ways that you can improve. Some of those ways align with positive health outcomes, and some of those don't. And that's where I think that line should be, right?
But then you imagine the logistics of this. You're trying to test someone for doping. You'd have to look at their whole
it might not always.
history.
It
Do
might
you know
not,
what I mean? You
it
have
might
to
not
look at
always
their
be
medical
clear.
records to see if they've.
Oh no, not per person. I just mean in general. You know.
But you have to enforce it per person.
Yeah. I'm just saying you have a whole lot of procedures that are performance enhancing, and the ones that you deem are illegal should be the ones that have a negative effect.
What if you could do?
It's not always going to be clear
Sure.
cut. I'm granted there'll be these cases where we don't know, the science isn't there and stuff.
Sure, but what if you have like performance enhancing drugs that with moderation can be very beneficial?
Yeah, but if they're beneficial for your health and they make you go better at sport, I don't have a problem with them being drugs.
Steroids, EPO, things of this nature, as
Well,
long as
I
it's
know,
done
and-
moderation. Just like how Julien did the altitude training and optimized the
Yeah,
protocol. What if there was
but-
research like that
No,
done?
but it's not like, I think you're confusing two things. If it's not, it'll be in like used in moderation. I mean, like beneficial for the health overall. Like not just okay. Like they can do it safely and make them better at the sport.
No, overall,
know?
yeah. But okay,
Like
if
maybe
you-
there should
but-
be limits on how much people can train. For instance,
No, I think that's
if
stupid.
it's deemed that training too much can hurt
stupid,
you,
right?
you know.
That's a nanny statement.
But I think the type of thing is that people aren't going to train too much anyway, because when you train too much, it's bad for the sport performance. So
yeah,
they always juggle.
but I was just gonna say, no, athletes have a crazy tendency to take it to the nth degree, bro.
Yeah.
And I'm no professional athlete at all, far from it. But I've been obsessed to the point where all I've wanted to do was train, and I've done jujitsu like 7 days a week, sometimes 2-3 times a day, like twice, 3 times is an exaggeration. But there are times like I'd wake up in the morning, I was exhausted, my whole body was hurting, but then I'd be like, you can't be a bitch, you gotta train. Athletes, imagine that, dude. There's a goal 4 years from now, or a year from now, or there's a fight 2 months from now, dude. You're gonna call yourself a bitch and say, get up and do the work. You know what I mean? But let's...
Yeah, no, but I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at it.
It's not.
Because athletes are smart now, and they're backed by science all the time.
I think that's naive.
Maybe the athlete wants to like train all the time, but the people who have their heads screwed on understand that there's a good amount to train and there's a good amount to take off, and then you eat this much for breakfast, and then like I don't know about the UFC, but like
other sports are like
you know
that.
what
To
I
your
mean?
point, I agree
Cricket
with
Australia, you know what I
Very
mean?
much so,
Those
yeah.
guys have dietitians,
Yes.
like sports scientists with them every day. Like it's calculated how much they're going to be training and what they're going to be doing and all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's,
No, I agree with you. Let's move this conversation to something equally trippy, and that's gene doping.
Yeah.
Have you heard of myostatin inhibitors?
no.
So myostatin inhibitor. So apparently there's a gene that gets activated, and I think this is involved in muscle differentiation, and I could be wrong, but what happens is if you get a mutation in that, and there's whippets, you know those dogs?
Yeah.
Whippets. Have you ever seen one?
Yeah.
Have you seen the big bulky versions of them?
No.
Dude, can you Google that? Like literally. Wait,
What do you want me to Google?
Just whippet.
Bulky whippet?
Yeah, like whippet, like
Bulky
yoked.
bulky whippet?
No, like yoked whippet. You know. Let's see.
Ripped whippet?
Whip. Oh my goodness. It's like impossible having a conversation, let alone doing a podcast, man.
Ripped whippet. I better be careful though.
Why?
I don't know.
No, like bulky. I don't know. Bulky whippet.
Bulky whippet.
Bulky whippet.
Anyway, continue your story.
Dude,
continue your story.
Look at this. Look at this shit, man. Look at this shit. The dog on the right, bro. For the folks who can't see, can you see that? Can you, let me
Take it up there.
Yeah, let me show you guys, because Alex, no. like tripping out. What the hell? Look at that.
Oh yeah.
Dude, that is the craziest shit. So what they're doing is, I think what people are doing, and this is, I think, happening in China, I believe. People are taking, don't tip over the camera. They're taking myostatin inhibitors, and it apparently just makes you huge. Like, it makes you really bulky and strong. And I could see this, I mean, in the future, where gene editing is so precise and accurate that you just go and they just inject you with something, and next thing you know, within a month you have 10-20 kilos extra muscle. You're like 3 times faster.
So is that doping? Should that be illegal?
That is gene doping.
Yeah,
dude.
yeah. Should
and
that be
that's
illegal?
coming, but that's coming up.
Yeah. But do you think that should be illegal?
Dude, I don't know. Maybe we should have a new league for every sport and just put the X-Men.
That's what
league.
it's almost got to come to, though, because I was thinking this as well.
But then that's gonna be
it's like the Paralympic Games, right? Like no, like hear me out.
Yeah.
Eventually, like amputee limbs are going to get to a stage, and robotics is going to get to a stage, and these types of things that humans can, like, lift weights way heavier than a normal human could, or run like way faster, like, run the 100 meters in 5 seconds or something ridiculous. Yeah, just take these huge springing steps or something like that. Eventually, it's going to get to the stage where, like, Paralympians and things like this can run faster and run better than people who don't have those disabilities.
The
and
Paralympics,
and then
they're going to take over the normal
Olympics.
Olympics.
What I'm saying. But that gets into this doping discussion then. So when do you call, like, when is it an enhancement? And I think it was for this, it might have been the Sydney Olympic Games. Those swimmers had those all over bodysuits, and they were like thinking of banning them because they had these swimsuits that went all the way down to here and down to here.
And they were friction.
Yeah, and they were made so, like, in a way, like a kind of like an F1 car is, you know what I mean? Like, so the water just didn't, like, touch their bodies, so they were, like, way faster. And people going, oh, hang on a minute, like, you can't use this technology. It's, like, not a real human. Like, but then you get into this big question, like, what is a real human? Where do you draw that line? And, like, are you going to have, like you said, you would have to have like different categories for every different person, for economic people who have less money to spend on it, people who this particular height, and some of those categories exist in some sports already, like weight classes and stuff with fighting and those types of things. So it's interesting. Like,
I can't imagine a time in the UFC where you have like the 205 testosterone replacement therapy champion of the world.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like what the fuck?
But, yeah.
What the
who
hell
knows?
is that nonsense?
Yeah.
But I
think you want to encourage people to do sport because sport is good, right? And that's where I get back to this doping thing. Like, the things that should be illegal should be the things that would discourage people from doing sport because they're bad for your health in the long term. They're bad for your body, that type of stuff. They should be illegal. Other things I think I'm cool with, because you want to encourage people to do sport. You want to encourage the kid who isn't 6'2" to play basketball just because he enjoys it,
Sure, but wait. I don't get that. I think that doesn't make sense. Just because people at the top are taking steroids and kicking ass doesn't mean that people at the bottom can't enjoy the game, because those people aren't aspiring to become like the top athletes.
But you're always like kids who love playing soccer, they all want to be Ronaldo, you know what I mean? They've all got that in.
But look, man, there's Mike Tyson.
If Ronaldo's a like cyborg with like 2 legs that help him like sprint from one end to the other, and the kids, are they going to be as inspired?
Yeah, they should chop off the legs and start doing like cyborg legs, dude. That's the way to do it. Right now, man, if I wanted to be like Mike Tyson, I can't be Mike Tyson. I don't have the genetics of that, dude. What difference is it? What difference does it make? I think it's more egalitarian if you chop people's legs off and give them those robotic legs, because then it's more equal. But
then those legs are good. Legs will be good for other things, and you want to set it up so the only way you can be good at soccer is if you cut off your legs, which are good for other things. You know what I mean?
No, you can be good at soccer, but you can't be great without those robotic legs.
But it's an interesting discussion. It's a hard one to draw lines on. It's a hard one to draw distinctions on. And like you say, like you don't want to discourage people from trying, and then you want athletes to be able to better themselves as well. And those things, I don't know, you got to trade off. I don't know. I think we've kind of talked enough. We only really talked about one big thing, but it was good.
Shit. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose we can call it a week, or
Yeah.
a day, or whatever.
We had the open day yesterday.
That was fun.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. We met.
Talked to lots of people.
Yeah. Alex was so funny. Alex was, but I did some sales reps work when I was younger, and the one thing they tell you is whenever you're trying to sell stuff, never ask questions. Just give them direction. Say, oh, that will look great on you. Try it on. You know what I mean? Do you think that'll look great? Do you want to try it on? That never works. You just want to give them instructions. And Alex yesterday was, it was so funny. Like, instead of like asking, do you guys want an interview? Oh, you'd be great for an interview. Why don't you get on stage and talk to him?
Yeah.
Dude, you are a genius. I love it. I love
That was good. I handed out a lot of pamphlets too.
Yeah, that was fun. Well, that's the type of shit that the audience would be super interested in, about how many pamphlets Alex gave away.
Yep. I didn't even count them, but I'll get back to you for next week, yeah? I'll make that happen.
Anyway, that's it for this week. We have...
Go and like our Facebook page.
Yeah. Twitter.
Give us a review.
Yeah, please do. It really does help. And
send us your feedback.
We'd like to hear that off you. And listen to our episodes. And refer this to a friend, for God's sake. I always forget to this one. Yeah,
true.
just share this. If you like an episode, if you think your friend will find a certain episode interesting because of the topic or our guest, then just share that episode with them. Say, hey, listen to this. Yeah. If you think that an hour and something is too long, share one of our abridged episodes, which you can find through our website, blabcoach.com/abridged. Don't forget the /. Shit.
You'll find it.
Yeah, you'll find it. If you can't,
blabcoach.com.
If you can't find the abridged episodes, don't listen to us. No, do. No, anyway, see you guys.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to Blab Coats. Rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, because it does help us spread the word. And if you like what we're doing here, then help us grow it by sharing this with a friend of a friend, or your mailman, even your mailman's mailman. We also want to hear from you, so send us questions or comments to blabcoats@gmail.com. And if you have any interesting questions or comments, then we'll talk about it on air.